in the 21st century, particularly in the kind of the knowledge economy, where we're hiring people to use their brains, then we're going to have to think slightly differently about this, because otherwise we end up with situations where people will slavishly follow rules, or they'll follow rules where we can see them, but actually where they think we can't see them, they might not do that. And rules don't necessarily apply in all situations. And so if we're reliant on this contract, in other words, we're just going to tell you to do it, and we're not going to think about how you feel in this process. Remember, human beings are sentient. They will react. We all smell BS when we come across it. We all know which rules, regulations, and requirements we think are good and which ones we think are less good. So we have views on things, and that will color our behavior towards it. And so my point with the employment contract fallacy is not to say that employers should never tell employees what to do, or that they don't have the right to do it, but to recognize that in certain circumstances, if you're relying on a legal contract, that is putting you in a situation where, if we think about other contexts where we rely on contracts, whenever we're looking at the small print in contracts, something has gone wrong.
That's Christian Hunt talking about humanizing rules. And this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome and welcome back to another episode of the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host, and this is the show in which we use the lenses of risk and uncertainty to understand ourselves and our world a little bit better. Today, we have a fabulous conversation with Christian Hunt, who is making his third appearance on the show. This time, Christian joins me to talk about his excellent new book, Humanizing Rules, which is all about using effective techniques that work with rather than against the grain of natural human decision-making in designing rules. In the book, and also on this podcast, Christian challenges widely held assumptions about managing the risks posed by people and their relationship with rules. And as Christian so often very aptly puts it, helps rule makers think about not just how they'd like people to behave, but how people are likely to behave. If you've not come across Christian before, he is the founder of Human Risk, a consultancy that brings behavioral science into ethics and compliance. He is also the host and producer of his own show called the Human Risk Podcast. He is always engaging and challenges our thinking. And after listening to this, no matter if you're a rule maker or a rule taker, and depending on the context, we are often both, you won't ever think about rules in quite the same way again. So let's talk about humanizing rules with Christian Hunt.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, Ben.
So I don't think we need to spend too much time introducing you because this is your third time on the show, but for those listeners who might not have been a listener of mine before then and don't know very much about you or who you are and what you do, I think that would be a good place to start.
Awesome. So I'm the founder of a company called Human Risk, and what that specializes in is the risk it's named after, which I define as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. And so what I'm really looking at here are situations where we are trying to influence human behavior and human decision making for a risk mitigation purpose. So that might be ethics, that might be compliance, that might be health and safety, all of these sorts. And you can think about general line management, right? Getting people to do things we want, not do things that we don't. And so it's really looking at how can we use behavioral science to do that more effectively? Because many of the people that do that either don't think about it and just do what they've always done, or don't think particularly behaviorally. And what brought me into that was a background in financial services, where I became an accidental regulator. And I always have to say after the crisis. So this was 2011. So after the 2008 crisis, they were looking to shake up regulation a little bit because, as we know, the regulators had missed certain things. And so I became this accidental regulator tasked with looking at international banks in the UK, trying to keep them on the straight and narrow, making sure things didn't go wrong. And I spent most of my time in that role looking at one particular firm, which was UBS. And you'll know that if a regulator is looking at you in great detail, it's not because you're doing a stellar job. They had all sorts of problems. There was a rogue trader whose work was discovered within 6 days of me starting my new regulatory role. And so, cutting a very long story short, at the regulator, having spent most of my time looking at UBS, that's where I ended up. I became COO at the regulator for a while. and then realized I wasn't cut out to be a central banker or lifelong regulator. And I went and then ate my own regulatory cooking in compliance and risk at UBS, where I was having to implement lots of the things I'd imposed on the firm. And it was there that I realized, because I knew where the rules were coming from, and I was having to take responsibility for them on the ground, that it wasn't landing in the way that was intended. And I realized if it wasn't landing with me, then it wasn't probably landing with the business. And so began this journey of how do we solve this problem, which is organizations have things they need people to do or things they don't want people to do. How do they make that happen? And very often it's just a logical approach of we're just going to tell you to do it and expect it to happen. And that's a logical approach, but it's not necessarily a human one. And so I started to try and find a way around that, started to look at behavioural science, which was a subject I'd always been interested in, deploying that, set up a behavioural science function within the firm. And then in 2019, just before the world changed radically, I stepped out on my own, and I now work with a range of different clients in a lot of different sectors. So everybody from chemical weapons inspectors through financial services and a number of other regulated spaces, helping them to solve this problem. And that means both how do we get people to do those things, but also if we've got regulations, we'll have a regulator that's standing behind that. So how do we also explain to the regulator and let them understand that we're taking this subject seriously? So you need to have there's a thinking about the actual underlying challenge, but then also we have to keep them happy. And sometimes those things can be incompatible as regulators want us to do strange things. So that's basically, I was going to say in a nutshell, it's quite a large nutshell, Ben, but that's what I do.
If you've been a listener of the show, I always go for the people that answer that question in long, windy ways, because those are the most interesting people in the world. And I love how you combined behavioral science to something that, for whatever reason, it seems logical now, but people that work in ethics and compliance typically don't have that skill set. And we're in the business, or those who are doing any kind of setting of rules, influencing human behavior and influencing human decision making. And so it makes, logical sense. And yet I think the types of people that do those types of regulatory roles and compliance roles don't typically have that kind of background. And so it's a wonderful way of really addressing fundamentally, it's a big gap. And so I just love what you do. So this is great. And so Humanizing Rules, I've got that in front of me, your new book. It's a fabulous book. And I love how it's kind of organized. And I'm just wondering what led you to, because writing a book, man, that's got to be a really, it has to be a slog at times, difficult. But what led to, producing this?
So, I've spent a lot of time in life kind of just deciding to do things and then working out what it means afterwards. And so it's sort of like I look back now and I think you're right. It's a ton of work. And anybody who's listening that is thinking of writing a book to make money, do not do it. It's the most underpaid task I've ever performed, because you get minuscule amounts back in terms of royalties, and it takes a heck of a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and there's a ton of wasted effort because you start things. So it's not a recommended strategy, but I decided in the same way, and I think this will resonate with you, Ben, in the same way that I thought I will have a podcast. So in 2019 as well, I resisted having a podcast while I was employed by someone else because I thought I won't feel free to speak. And so I kind of came out and I went, I have a podcast. And the book was a similar sort of, I will have a book. And so I started, I'd sort of always written things down, right? As I was trying to make sense of the world. I was trying to sort of just help myself to think a little bit better about it. And what I found was the challenge when you've got, there's a snappy title, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, right? It rhymes. So right, for people who know behavioural science, the rhymer's reason effect. We like things that rhyme. It feels like it must mean something. And so I had this kind of branding piece, but what I was having to do was to really take people on a journey and explain why this matters. And that, I just thought that's interesting because it's not obvious to people. And to your point, and I think the reason it's not obvious is we think of ethics and compliance from the perspective of the organization that is trying to get us to do that. And so when you look at somebody in those functions, to answer your earlier point, what's happening is they're thinking organizationally. Here is the challenge for the organization. We have these rules that we need the organization to comply with and be seen to comply with. So let's just foist that on people. And what that's not recognizing is that there's a translation effort required to get that outcome. You've got to get people to do certain things. and if you and not do certain other things. And if you do that, then the organization will be compliant. And so as I was having to sort of explain it to people, in other words, from a business perspective, no one was waking up in the morning and going, hey, what I need is some behavioral science guy that can help through. People just don't think in those terms. So I was having to get them to think in those terms. So how can you do that? Well, a book is a great way to sort of spread the word and to get people to think about it. And if somebody's committed to reading a book, then you've got a bit more space to be able to explain things. So I think the genesis was note taking for me. I thought, well, why don't I put that out there? And then I realized it was a useful, both a marketing, but also a sort of introductory piece. And, I'm a company of one. I haven't yet thought to scale up my business. And so when people are hiring me, I'm not really a scalable proposition in the traditional sense because I've only got so much time. So a book is it's a very old school, but it's an on-demand product. And so I can say to people, do have a look at the book, and then we can have a conversation when you've read the book. And so it's a great way of sort of starting it off. And so that was the initial bit. And then the latter bit was really to say, I think there are some really simple things that we can get people to think about that will help them to be better at what they're trying to do. So if you're in the business of influencing human decision making, having some knowledge and some ideas and some frameworks and some inspirations that you can take into your work to say, as I try and solve this problem, if I'm a compliance officer and I've got people not doing what I need them, not following a particular rule, how do I think about that? And so what I wanted to start to do was to take some of the practical tools that I deployed within UBS and then took to my clients when I set myself as a business and say, let's write some of this stuff down. Not in a kind of like slavish, if you do all these things, it will, those sort of diets that people go, if you follow the following steps, you will lose weight, right? We all know that's nonsense. The book's not about that. What it's about is practical ideas to say, here's some things you could try and some things to think about. And that works one or two ways. Either it helps you to design things in a way that's more likely to make people do what you want. Or other people do what you want, or you can use it as a diagnostic tool. If it's not working, you've got something in place. You can use the same dynamics to say, well, why might this be? And then I can have a better crack at dealing with it. And so really it's a combination, I think, of sort of helping to tell the story and set out the stall, but then also for those people that are on board and who wants to know how to do this thing and just want to have their way of thinking challenged. It's a practical book as well.
Fantastic. And did you find that producing it helped clarify your own thinking? Did it sharpen the way in which you created and deliver your propositions to clients?
Yeah, totally. And what you'll have noticed is that there's a ton of stories in there. So what I wanted to do was not spend a lot of time talking about things you can read in academic journals and long tedious. It's very much designed to be for the average person to read. So whether you've got you're not working in compliance or ethics, you have zero knowledge of behavioural science. It's like, here's some simple stuff that we can all recognise. And so it picks real life situations, stories from the news, some high profile stuff, some stuff that involved me. Right, I thought it was important to have a few things. There's a few stories of dumb stuff I have done, just because I think it makes it more. And what I wanted to do is really just give people some stories to tell. And so the challenge when you start thinking about stories, and that's a lot of what I communicate to people is really to highlight what we know goes on in the real world. So stuff you and I would recognize from the news or from going to a supermarket or crossing the street, and stuff we see happening around us, going to the airport, all of those things. Is to say, what does that tell us? And if we compare what happens in those scenarios, very often what happens within organizations is the worst of what we see in the real world. And some of the really smart things that are very effective at getting us to behave in a particular way somehow don't get deployed in organizations. And so what I want to do is pin this in the real world. One, because I don't know what's going on in all the companies and all the places this book might go. I don't know. I'm not an expert in lots of individual companies, but what I do know is what we see in the real world. And so what I was trying to do is pick some stories that I thought would resonate. And as you start to do that, you just think, well, which are the best stories I've got? And it's a bit, so you've got to pick the greatest hits and things that will, things that I think will really help to make the point, but also that will work with a global audience. And so if I'm telling a story about something that's happened in Germany, I may have to give some context for people that have never been to the country and may not understand it. So I tried to pick things that were high profile enough. So the hardest bit was really selecting those. And so, and again, with things like frameworks and explaining it and the language that you use, it's really around saying, how do I make this as accessible as possible? And so in many respects, the challenge of the book wasn't writing it. It was like what not to put in there. and how to take things out and how to structure it in a way that would maintain people's attention. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It was a lot of fun. If I ignore the fact that there's a ton of stuff that never made it through to the final version that I still think is super valuable, then that was probably the most challenging bit. But it's absolutely helped to crystallize it. And I think one of the things I have learned is I think writing things down. There is something really powerful about that, and writing our ideas down. And I think that's it's why literacy, I think, is incredibly important, because you can read other people's thoughts, but you also get to write your own down and to challenge yourself. And so, yes, absolutely. For all of those things, came into play when pulling this, frankly, labor of love together.
I love it. Fantastic. So let's dive into some of that. And maybe we can just kind of start with the problem, really. The ways in which we just, you talk about things like the employment contract fallacy. You talk about knowing your audience. You talk about the sort of the traditional toolkit, and you highlight, you bring this, I think, really well together with a story. And it's not your story, but it's the story of the now infamous Oscar night fiasco, the PwC Oscar night fiasco, and perhaps we could just start there. And why did you pick that as an example of human risk, and use that to lead into your framework and the other things in your book?
Yeah, so let's just quickly recap the story for anybody that's not familiar, or those that have forgotten. And the lovely thing about this one is you can go onto YouTube and you can see this happening, right? This is something that unfolded in front of the world's TV cameras. It's been captured for posterity. It's been analyzed to hell, and so it's a really, really good, high profile thing. And I wanted to pick something where nobody died as a result of this, and lots of examples of human decision making where people are killed or seriously injured. And I didn't want anything that was sort of serious in that sense, but I wanted something that was sort of accessible. And so what you've got here is in 2017, you've got this guy, Brian Cullinan, who is a PwC partner, and he's got the job of handing out envelopes at the Oscars. And so what he's been doing for the weeks beforehand is doing a whole PR campaign, because the reason, obviously, that the PwC want to be involved in this is to highlight, is to get a heck of a lot of publicity. So they're the auditors for the Movie Academy. But one of the things they do is they sort of there as part of the process, designed to demonstrate this process is run rigorously. And so he's doing all these interviews. Him and his fellow partner Martha Ruiz are doing all these interviews talking about the nature of the role. And so I had seen all these things coming up to it, and they talk about it looks really difficult, it looks really easy, but actually it's quite hard. But we've got a lot of controls in place. We take this very, very seriously. It's a very important job. And then on the night, for the biggest award of the night, the one thing you wouldn't want to have happen, he hands out the wrong envelope. And I find this absolutely fascinating, because here is someone who's working for a professional services firm. They audit other firms. They advise people on controls. And he manages to mess up and hands out the wrong thing. And it's highly embarrassing. It's on TV, and it takes them time to unpick it. So in this little moment, you've got a series of things happening. But the one thing that's really surprising is that we would tend to think, okay, here's a senior guy with a lot of experience. Experience ought to not make us screw up, right? We tend to equate experience with knows what they're doing. And yet we had this one instance. And of course we know, and I didn't write this in the book, but of course we know, but if we look on social media, we can see that he was tweeting from backstage. It's probably not wrong to suggest he was thinking himself more as a participant than a service provider to the event. And,
a bit starstruck, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And the stories that he'd wanted a walk-on part and all these things. So you've got somebody there who's messed up. Now, I don't think for 1 minute that he's decided that he was going to screw this thing up. Right? Mm-hmm. This is clearly a mistake. It's clearly an accident. And it's in effect, it cost him his role at the Oscars. It almost cost PwC theirs. It was massively embarrassing for them. And so I just think that's a really interesting microcosm of the challenges that we face, which is to say that we can't simply assume that people will do what they're told. And there was a protocol in place for exactly this reason. In fact, the irony is the protocol they had in place, which was to have backup envelopes, actually was what caused the problem, because he handed out one of the backup envelopes. And so they hadn't thought about all of the human dynamics, which if with hindsight, we can sit there and go, well, of course, this senior guy who's almost on stage, if we're not careful, there is a risk that they will get carried away in the gloom moment. And of course, he's a media coverage person, right? His whole job is to know the media industry, know the big players. So he's going to kind of get wrapped up in the excitement of it. He's not somebody that's dispassionately participating in this. And so I just thought that was a really interesting jumping off point. And it was interesting for me, one, because I think it's a great case study, but two, it really drove my thinking, because I remember having seen all these ads. I didn't stay up to watch the Oscars. I mean, I tend to think those award ceremonies go on for a bit too long. Yeah. But I woke up and I heard about this thing. And I just literally was like, what? They handed out the wrong envelope? That you had one job to do? That's insane. And then I started to look at it, and it really resonated with me as a story. And that's why I thought it was just important to have there. But as I say, go have a look at some of the videos of this stuff, because it's like, even if you've watched it, I've probably watched that thing like 200 times. And right. I know what's coming, right? There's no, and I'm still blown away by it. And it's astonishing. And the time it takes them to react and all these things is just amazing. So for me, it's it's a good illustration, and a safe illustration that we can all recognize and associate with. And it's quite amusing, of course, in all the context. And so that's why it really had to go into the book.
Yeah. And it's not exactly as if, the victim being a partner at PwC is a figure that anyone's going to cry too many tears around, right?
No. And look, and also you don't go and do interviews saying how this looks really, really easy, but it's really difficult, but because you're so competent, that's what you might put in the hubris bracket. And so I think if you add all of it together, it is just a beautiful, simple case. But as you say, it's like, no one got hurt. There wasn't the net cost to us is we all had a little bit of a laugh and a valuable lesson, and it allowed me as a springboard for the book. So that was the rationale for picking that.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And so what are some of the other challenges associated with designing and implementing rules that if there are a few favorite ones? I like this concept of the employment contract fallacy. If perhaps you could explain that.
I think for me that's really good, because the logic that is so often deployed by organizations is to sort of say, we can tell you what to do, and so you'll do it. And the logic that is, and it's not, they don't often say it in these terms, but the logic is what I call the employment contract fallacy. And the employment contract fallacy says, because we pay you, we can tell you what to do. Now that's legally correct, right? We all sign our employment contract, and we know that means that we have certain obligations. For example, they might tell you where to go to work, what dress code might be relevant, what you're allowed to do. Some companies will have things like social media policies that prevent. So we're signing up to a set of terms and conditions, that some of which involve us to do behaving in a particular way, and following certain rules. And so that is legally correct. And so, it can be used in courts if people don't comply with that. But the challenge with it is that organizations often just go, well, because we've got that in place, right? People will just have to go to training. They will have to read rules, policies. They will have to follow the rules. And if they don't, we'll fire them. And of course, that is correct on one level, but and there are lots of times where you might say, well, that's a perfectly okay relationship. If I've got people in certain circumstances, I'm going to want to tell them exactly what to do. In a nuclear power station, I don't want someone getting creative with what goes into the reactor. Food safety, I want people to just slavishly follow safety rules because it's for everybody's protection. And so in those situations, you could say, well, that's fine. But there are lots of other situations where, if we think about ethics as a good example, where mandating what is ethical is quite hard, because in one situation, it might be different to another one. And there are lots of things nowadays where we can't see what people are doing. We can't be in every single meeting. We don't know all of the nuances. And we've got factors like technology coming in and changing it. So cryptocurrencies, if you're in financial services, rules that are written for stocks and shares aren't necessarily going to apply to cryptocurrencies because it's just different beasts, and so there are different risks. And so in the 21st century, particularly in the kind of the knowledge economy, where we're hiring people to use their brains, then we're going to have to think slightly differently about this, because otherwise we end up with situations where people will slavishly follow rules, or they'll follow rules where we can see them, but actually where they think we can't see them, they might not do that. And rules don't necessarily apply in all situations. And so if we're relying on this contract, in other words, we're just going to tell you to do it, and we're not going to think about how you feel in this process. Remember, human beings are sentient. They will react. We all smell BS when we come across it. We all know which rules, regulations, and requirements we think are good and which ones we think are less good. So we have views on things, and that will color our behavior towards it. And so my point with the employment contract fallacy is not to say that employers should never tell employees what to do or that they don't have the right to do it, but to recognize that in certain circumstances, if you're relying on a legal contract, that is putting you in a situation where, if we think about other contexts where we rely on contracts, whenever we're looking at the small print in contracts, something has gone wrong. And so what I'm suggesting there is recognize where that employment contract makes, where you should and could and need to rely on it. And other times where you say, yeah, okay, legally we have the right to do X, but just because we can do that doesn't necessarily mean we get the outcome. And if the thing that we need people to do or not do has a qualitative component, in other words, we need people's engagement with it. We need them to, to act in a particular way to a certain standard, providing good customer service, being ethical. Those things are really hard to define. We got to start thinking of how we work with employees rather than just shouting at them and telling them what to do. And so it's not to say that we can't do that, but let's recognize situations when that makes sense. And let's recognize when that poses a particular risk. And I think often we don't think about those things. We just blindly go into a particular model. And that's what I'm trying to get people to just reflect on.
Yeah, I can't think of anything less human than relying on a contract to govern a relationship, right? Like, as you said, if you're doing that, then something's gone wrong, whether it's a relationship with a supplier or, a marriage contract or, whatever the thing is, it's, and it also presupposes, and you mentioned something I think that's very important, that partner did not obviously intends to create the situation that, he didn't mean to hand out the wrong envelope. Most people want to do the right thing. And it may simply just be a question of it not being very easy to do the right thing sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's a sort of that point you make around the presumption is very, very important, which is we start from a premise of, and this is where I think risk, compliance, ethics, anybody in the business of managing and mitigating human risk has to be thinking about the challenge is a bit of a translation thing. So on the one hand, we've got the corporate objective, right? So we got some stuff we don't want to have happen or some stuff that we do need to have happen, which may be some rules or some safety risks or whatever it happens to be that we need to. And then we got to think about how do we translate that so that we can get the people in there. And often that translation doesn't happen. So what you get is training that will tell you what the regulation says. Now, I don't think that's desperately helpful because none of us in our life, we don't read. If you look at instruction manuals that come with products and the safety stuff that go, we don't read those. So generally, we don't want to engage with something that doesn't make sense to us. And so I think the role of people in those positions is to start doing that translation service of saying, look, here's what we need them to do. How do we make that seem relevant and interesting to them? And communicate that in that way. And so it's starting to recognize that human beings, we react better to things that engage us. So things that feel like they're relevant to us, things that grab our attention for some reason. And if we can start to recognize that, and if you look at, advertising is a good example. Advertising, yes, to a certain extent, it relies on logic. So if you're selling a car, there will be statistics in there for the petrol heads that love that. But they will also come in with a whole load of emotional stuff about this. This is, won't you look cool when you drive this car? Or this is going to make your family safe. Or you've got to carry a lot of stuff around with you. This has lots of space in it. And this is going to protect you on the road. It's got lots of technology that will stop you having an accident. Right? All of that stuff is an emotional sell. And so if we look at the balance in advertising between fact and emotion, and they blur the boundaries, of course, we'll see that it's a lot more emotional. And some of the techniques that are used to sell things are completely illogical, make no sense whatsoever from a logical perspective, but they work. And we know that they work because advertisers spend tons of money on it, and they wouldn't spend money on it if it wasn't effective. And so when I look at that, I just think if we're in the same thing, we're trying to persuade people, we're not trying to persuade them to buy washing powder or a car, but what we're trying to do is persuade them to follow a set of rules or principles or not to do something or do something. Then shouldn't we just be deploying a similar basis, just work on a similar basis and say, what can we use that will get to people on a human level? And again, I've had to do that in the book, right? Because the last thing I want to do is talk theory at people. That's why I've used stories in the book to try and bring it alive. Yeah. Because I know that 300 pages of just like, here's what you should do, right, would be ironic for the subject matter of the book. And so we've got to start, I think, engaging people on a human level and say what gets through to people. Because if we're not getting, and getting through to them is the first challenge. The second challenge is then getting them to actually accept what we're doing. But if we're not even getting through to them, then that's problematic. And so how do we grab their attention, and then we can work out what we do when we've got their attention. But it's it's those sort of principles that I'm trying to bring in, and they are all around us in other contexts, just not in this one.
I think that there's a lot of just a mismatch, I think, sometimes between those of us who sort of set rules, and that doesn't have to be anyone working in risk compliance or anything. If you're just trying to get someone to do something, and the ways in which human beings act. And I think there's increasingly, I think that for the vast majority of the time, we make decisions emotionally, and then we just use our brains to rationalize why we've done it, while we've bought a certain thing, and yet as you talk about the sort of traditional toolkit, and it doesn't seem to do the job at all well.
Yeah, I mean, so when I talk about the traditional toolkit, what I do in the book is track through what happens to us as we're growing up in very, very simple terms. And so if we think about it, when we first arrive on the planet, we have no clue about anything. Right? We've got no experience of this world. And so what our parents and carers do at that stage is they set very tight parameters. They either physically control the environment, or they set very, very tight so that nothing can go wrong. And so, because we know if a small child crawls around, they can find themselves in all sorts of things. They just don't understand the environment. And so it's very, very tightly controlled. And then as we get older, different techniques come into play. So a good example would be where effectively we incentivize certain behaviors. Now, I call it bribery and punishment, but we can call it all sorts of, where in essence, we're bringing economic incentives to place, right? So if you do this, you'll get a reward. If you fail to do this, you will be punished. And so we bring those things into bear. When people get more sophisticated, we adopt different techniques where we adopt a sort of marketing approach where we will say, we recognize that you're an adult. So if I point out to you the risks of something, you are likely to behave in a way that is what I want, because you'll recognize and understand the risks. And so we use a variety of these different techniques in different situations. And so there are plenty of examples where this traditional toolkit, and there are a couple of other elements I haven't mentioned, but just for in the interest of time, where there are certain situations where you are going to want to follow these traditional approaches. And of course, when I talk about these, I isolate them, but actually we use a multitude of these different techniques. But there are going to be some situations where you do want to treat people like they're small children, either because the consequences of that behavior is so severe that we just can't afford to have it happening. So we're going to put massive control around it. I don't care that you're an adult if you do this. And a good example would be that if you think about underground trains, anybody building a new one now will put in doors on the platform to stop people getting onto the tracks. And that's partly it. That's obviously to stop people who are trying to take their lives, but it's also to stop accidents from happening. That's a sensible thing. And so you might say there's a good example of controlling an environment but it's just not possible for anybody to get on the tracks. Job done, right? We've mitigated that risk. And I don't think anybody complains about that particularly because it doesn't feel particularly true. So there's a good example of doing that well. Ditto, I've mentioned food safety in nuclear power stations. Times where you're going to have rules that are very prescriptive, anything involving electricity, for example, the laws around that don't change, right? Electricity plus water equals potential risk. So let's not mess around in those situations. But if we're in an environment where we're trying to get people to be creative, and we are hiring them for their creative capabilities and their ability to think and question and challenge and be innovative, then they're not going to switch that off when they're confronted with a set of rules. And so then we have to start thinking and saying, well, do these traditional rules, does it make sense to treat people who we would otherwise treat as being intelligent as idiots? And sometimes the answer to that might be yes, but let's think about it if we're doing it. And if not, then maybe we need to think a little bit more. And so what I encourage people to do is to take the traditional toolkit, all the ways that we do things, think about when you're deploying it. And often we don't. We just do what we've always done, or we do what everybody else is doing. And so say to ourselves, is that a good idea or not? And maybe there might be a different way to do it. So, a good example would be to use, we are heavily influenced by other people. So if we think about being ashamed in public, is there a better way? And we've got to be careful about this, right? There are ethical components to these things, but there may be a better way to get people to behave by using some form of public shaming and highlighting it. So if you can embarrass people, then they're less likely to do something that they find embarrassing, because none of us wants to be embarrassed in front of lots of other people. And so, if you've ever stood at a line in checkout, and I spend a lot of time in Germany, right? There's the checkouts in Germany, super fast. Everything goes through. So woe betide you if you hold anyone up. It's a socially embarrassing situation. So if you're fumbling for your money or your card doesn't work, the social embarrassment associated with that, and everybody is packing their stuff in their bags as quickly as possible. I mean, it's insane, right? It's a little bit too much one way. But there's a really good example of a context where we know if we're holding a load of other people up, there's a degree of embarrassment associated with that. And so we can use that and think, are there situations in which the most effective way to get people to comply might be to find some kind of use of peer pressure or social or publicity around that? Now, that's not something that sits in that traditional toolkit at all. And so what I'm trying to get people to do is say, if we understand the behavioral drivers, there are a whole load of other things that we could consider, that we could bring into play. And if we are going to use any technique, whether it's one of the sort of newer behavioral ones or one of the traditional techniques, if we understand the drivers of human decision making, if what we've chosen doesn't work, we've got a really good idea about how to tweak it, because we can say, okay, well, that was based on a presumption of X. That turned out not to be true. Let's try tweaking those things. So I talk about it as a toolkit because it's not prescriptive. This is what you should do in this situation. It's like, let's think about why. And very often we use the wrong technique. And if a little bit like using, anybody that's sort of grown up being taught by either a school or by their parents about the right tools for the job, they find the right tool for the job you're trying to solve, and it becomes a lot easier. And that's what I'm trying to get people to think about is think about the fact that you're using a tool. You might just be doing it intuitively, but is that the best possible thing? If it works, brilliant. If it doesn't work, try another tool.
I was just sort of linking Germany to the word shame, or something, like the sort of the sense of, I don't know what it's like. I have not been in a German grocery store, but I can imagine you want to get your money out in enough time. You want to move your items through the through the cashier as quickly as you can. And you obviously want to avoid, and I know I think you give an example about as well, boarding planes, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think I mentioned it in the book. Maybe I do. This is
okay. Maybe it's something about like get your passport out, like you're sort of.
Yeah, but there are a whole. Airports are a really good example of where what they are trying to do is if you think about it, it's a little bit like a sort of factory where they just want to push people through the machine as quickly as possible. So there's various conflicting things here, right? So on the one hand, what airlines want to do is to get their plane. They don't want their plane sitting on the ground because that costs them money. Airports have a slightly different thing, right? Which is that where they make money from retail. So there's a little bit of the airport wants people to hang around for a little bit. Right. So there's conflicting interest there, and who wins that particular battle is interesting. Airport security is a good example of something where you want it to be slightly inefficient. And that's the bit I talk about in the book.
You talk about in the book, yeah.
Because airport security, we often approach that and we go, God, this is taking ages. This is a bit seems to take longer than it should. And even with some of these new technologies where they scan, you don't have to take your laptop and there's no liquid restrictions in the latest. Even in those situations, it's a little bit less efficient than it could be. And the reason for that is something that I refer to as theatre. And the purpose of airport security is, yes, on the face of it, it is to stop people with, who are trying to do something bad, getting weapons or bombs or whatever it is through airport security. And therefore, that's just, on the face of it, you'd say that's a control to stop bad people doing bad things. But it has a secondary purpose, which is to reassure those of us that are flying. And so the reason you make that process slightly longer than than it could is because you want to emphasize that it's happening. And so if we just went through it and it was super slick, we wouldn't notice it. And so they want to make it slightly slower. One, to destabilize somebody that was thinking of it. So if you were thinking of taking a bomb into a plane, if that process isn't quick, there's a risk of getting caught. And that's why they have those random checks. So even if you get past the machine, you might still get patted down. There's a likelihood of getting caught. So we're being slow. So they're slowing it down for them, but they're slowing it down for the rest of us as well, because they want you to remember so that you think, oh, I'm now in a secure area. I feel safer about it. And we can play a little thought experiment here to say, well, to demonstrate that that's true. If I said to you, here's two airlines, one of which had zero security and the other one had all other things being equal, right? And the other one had the level of security we have now, the majority of people would book the airline with security, right? Because why would, and so that tells you the significance and the importance that has. And so there's an example of a process that is controlled, that's done for a very deliberate reason. We don't go for the optimal quick answer. We put some friction in there to make that feel slightly differently. And the airlines do that. There's more performative stuff there around who gets to board the plane when. Why is it we make economy passengers walk through business class? There's a whole load of things. Right. Sometimes it's sometimes it's more practical, but often there's a psychological thing around it, which is this idea of theatre, which is we do things to send a signal to people. And so one of the lessons in the book is if you're doing theatre to influence human decision making, then you want to make sure you understand the audiences, plural, because very often there's more than one audience. And so if we think about when we're trying to deter bad people, we are also having an impact on the good people. So imagine we've got training that's designed for idiots who don't know what they're doing. That's fine. It might work with them. But we're also going to irritate a whole lot of other people going, why are they wasting my time with this nonsense? And the impact on the people who don't need it, or the people who think they don't need it, could be even more significant. And so often when we focus around rules, we focus around bad people. And let's design this so that we can't have bad outcomes. Well, to which I say, just think very carefully. If, for example, the reason your training is there is to stop bad people from doing bad things, bad people don't pay attention in training. If you're genuinely setting out to break the rules, the only reason you're turning up to training is to be seen to be turning up to training, so you don't flag up on some list. The second thing is you might be looking for loopholes. You might be probing to see where you can get away with things. But otherwise, you're not paying attention. So let's not focus all of our training on this in a way that sends a signal to everybody that we don't trust you, because that has consequences.
Yeah. When you were talking about that whole theater thing, I think you're spot on about audiences, because, well, first of all, too much theater for me personally pisses me off. I feel like but I can kind of see how in other contexts, if you're not, you talk about all these behavioral interventions, but if you don't know your audience, you could massively get it wrong, right? We're going to put now, everyone loves this sort of theater of, not everyone, like, I don't know if anyone's ever said we love the theater of airport security, but anyway, some bright spark in some organization sort of read that airport security does this wonderful thing of emphasizing security, and it's a little bit of theater, but then, taking that same intervention and putting it into something completely out of context is it's potentially not a good idea.
No, it's absurd. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that all airport security, all apparent inefficiencies in airport security are a good thing. Sure. That theatrical component plays a part in it. But I've been through processes where even knowing this stuff and looking at it, going, there is no way that is part of this. That's just incompetence or underinvestment or lack of staff or whatever. There'll be some other reason. But today, your example, if you said to somebody, okay, so I'm responsible for security in an office building, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy what airport security's done.
Yeah.
Right. With all of the bells and whistles and everything. Yeah. Right. That would be wholly disproportionate, deeply irritating. And if you said to every single employee, what we're going to do is we're going to search your bags before you enter and leave the building. Mm-hmm. Here's a good example, right? So you might get, if you were, and I used to work at the Bank of England. So anybody that works in the printing presses or the gold vaults, right? Places where there is something genuinely you might want to steal. And in the case, and there were cases, there's a really good movie actually of how there was an insider job at the Bank of England a number of years ago where people were at the printing press, and it actually wasn't from the printing press. They were stealing from, they were part of the function that was supposed to burn old notes. And what they did, they found a way to get those out in their underwear and various other things. Right? And so there's a genuine risk. So in those sorts of situations, it's perfectly reasonable to search stuff, because you say there is a genuine risk, and you could see a huge temptation, right? If your job's to burn old banknotes, there's a huge temptation to help yourself to a few. No one would ever know, all that kind of stuff, right? So in that situation, but if you did it in the average office, people would just be infuriated, and they would find it overreach. And on some level, they'd get pissed off with you as an organization. So they might try and we respond to, if we're irritated by a particular process, we'll find ways around it. So they might be irritated. They might choose not to join the organization or not to stick around. So we'd have a recruitment or can you get people back into the office type chat? And it's hugely costly. So you're right. It's if you just slavishly go, this is the way you do it over here, we should copy that's not necessarily good. On the other hand, it can be a really good idea if you take from a different context and you go, oh, here's how somebody else has solved a similar problem in a completely different context. That can give us some really good inspiration for how to manage something in a way we never thought of.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think brings us nicely on to this humans framework that you have around. Well, explain it to us. What is this framework, and how can maybe we just walk through it a little bit, just give people a flavor for what it is and how to use it. So
I believe there's an unwritten rule somewhere that you can't have a behavioral science book without having some kind of framework in there. So obviously that's a given it's Humanising Rules, I had to comply with that unofficial rule. But also what I wanted to do is to give people a handle on how to think about things from the perspective of your target audience. And in most cases, the target audience, the people you're trying to influence, are your employees. And so what I wanted to do was to say, how can we, and this is something this has been tried and tested in the wild, right? It says, how can we communicate simply to people things they ought to think about when you're trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes? And the challenge you've got, if I said to you, think about the people that are going to have to comply with your rules, the trouble you've got is that you suffer from something called the curse of knowledge, which is the more you know about something, the harder it is for you to imagine what it's like for people that don't. And so if you're an expert in compliance, in ethics, in risk, whatever it is, then it's quite hard for you to think about things from the perspective of the average employee. And I always say jokingly, the average employee is not interested in compliance. And people go, oh, and you go, I don't mean they're not interested in doing their job compliantly, but they're not interested in per se in compliance. They're interested in doing their job compliantly. So you have to help them to do that. And that's, we might think they are because we're interested in it. So we need to put ourselves in their shoes. How can we do that? Well, the answer is we need to start thinking about what factors might there be. And so humans is really, it's not an exhaustive list. It's just things that are relevant to how we perceive something. And in particular, how we perceive rules or requirements. But we can think about it for training. We can think about it for any other experience. Something that we sort of come across an experience, we come across something we're required to do or not do will have an impact on us. So what these factors do is help us to think about how might they react to it. Now, the important thing when we're looking at this framework, and this is the key bit in the book, is not to think about how we would like people to behave or react, but how they are likely to. In other words, when we write rules, we often use wishful thinking, right? Because this is important, they will pay attention. Because I've spent a lot of effort on this, they will. Because it would make our lives a lot easier if people did this. That's not what I'm getting. What I want people to do is to think about it genuinely. Think about what this is likely to happen. So the framework basically says, here are some components and things that you can think about. Sometimes these won't apply. Sometimes you can't you can't do anything about it. And if you can't do anything about a component that gives you a negative response, then you can just say, okay, that just means this potentially poses higher risk. So let's pick an example just to illustrate this. So the H in human, so each letter stands for a different word, the usual framework model. And so H stands for helpful. And what that's basically saying is, will the people that we are, and I always talk about asking to do something, but you could replace that with telling to do something. Will they find this helpful? And so we can think about that in the context of processes that we all go through, right? Is what I'm being asked, is that going to help me, or is that going to make my life harder? Do I find this is this additive to my life? So a traffic direction that requires a road that's been blocked that requires me to drive 5 kilometers around a loop to get to where I want to get to is de facto unhelpful. Something that gives me, and I mentioned this one in the book. There's a thing in Germany called the grüner Pfeil, green arrow. And on traffic, this is interestingly inherited from East Germany. And there are other regimes around the world that have a similar thing. And so they drive on the right in Germany. And so the idea here is that where you have got a traffic light, if you are held up at a junction, if there's a green arrow there, what you're allowed to do is override the red light if it is safe to do so. So you're still accountable for your action. Doesn't mean you can automatically go, but you don't have to wait for the light to change if, for example, if it's in the middle of the night and you're just doing a right turn. It's a very low risk turn in the scheme of things. So you can't do other turns, but you can do this right turn. And so they've added this particular thing in. And I look at that and think that's a really good example of something that's helpful, right? This is the road or traffic authorities recognizing that there will be situations in which this particular right, there's holding someone to turn right when there's nothing around, there's no risk, doesn't make any sense. And so that's an example of a helpful regulation. And so we're more likely to be positively disposed to that than an unhelpful one. And so the H in helpful is saying, let's think about it. And so we may say, well, actually, there isn't really don't have a strong view on this one, right? It's neither helpful nor unhelpful. Fine, move to the next one. But if you look at it and you go, actually, what we're asking them to do is something they're going to find incredibly helpful, right? It's good. Not theoretically helpful, I stress, but actually practically helpful. Make their lives easier, make their lives better. Then that's a very useful thing. If, on the other hand, it's unhelpful and they perceive it unhelpful, then that's going to be less useful. And so we then have a sense of how are they going to react to this particular rule. And then we can say to ourselves, well, look, can we make it more helpful? Is there something that we've got in this process that is inadvertently unhelpful that we could get rid of or that we could make easier? Or do we say to ourselves, there is nothing we can do about this, right? The reason we're imposing this is, insurance requirements are a classic example. Right? Here is something the insurer requires us to do, which frankly we think is stupid, but we have no choice, or a regulator requires us to do it. And so if we recognize that it feels unhelpful to people on the ground, we can say to ourselves, if we'll either try and do something, maybe we can change their perception of it, Or we just go, okay, it is what it is. But if we recognize that it's perceived to be unhelpful, could be perceived to be unhelpful, then actually maybe we need to put more effort monitoring it, because frankly, it's a good example of where people might not do it, right? If it's unhelpful to them, they're less likely to do it. And so what this idea of looking at something, is it helpful or not, is really designed to say, let's try and, if we have latitude to do things, we can design it to make it more helpful. Where we don't have latitude, we can recognize that it poses a greater risk. And remember, I said earlier on that this framework is both for design and diagnostics. So we have a rule that no one's complying with. Well, let's have a look and let's start with the H for helpful and say to ourselves, is this, like, what would people's perception of this rule be?
Right.
Are they likely? And we may identify that one of the drivers, and again, I never want to say that each element stands on its own. Points towards something that says this is generally perceived as being unhelpful. And you go, oh, okay, well, that gives us a clue for what we might try and do to either put more monitoring around that or to try and change people's perspectives. So H for helpful is the start. I mean, I can go through the rest of them if you want, but that's the basic. That's the basic idea behind it, as to sort of how each of the components works.
Yeah, well, maybe we can walk through the rest of them and maybe dive in with regard to one or two or something like that.
So
why don't we do that? And just a little point before we move on. Like, I think when you say helpful, it's helpful to that individual.
Correct.
What you're talking about,
it is what's in it for me. It is not because we often confuse, and this is why it's a powerful one to start with, because we will often say, well, okay, if this particular outcome happens, it's because it's helpful. It's helpful to the organization. That's irrelevant. Right. It's not irrelevant in the scheme of things. It's irrelevant for the purposes of what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to say, what is in it for me? And we've got to think about, not is it theoretically helpful for them? Right? Might it one day be helpful under certain circumstances? How will they perceive it in the moment? And so sometimes when we think about something that's unhelpful, if we really understood where it was coming from, right, we might then decide that actually, it is helpful. It is genuinely in my interest for that not to happen. But if I don't think in those terms, then I'm not going to see that, and I'm going to. And so you're right. This is very egocentric for the people that you're trying to influence, and we're flipping the traditional model.
And just speaking from experience of working in a central function, working with other people who make rules and things, that's incredibly hard at times, because if you're designing a rule somewhere in the center, I don't know, let's say, so at the moment I work at BT, one of the things we do is call centers. So we've got people that work in call centers. What is it like to be a call center worker? That's hard for someone in the center to understand what that might be like, or an engineer that is putting fiber into a home or something like that, and you're designing some rules for someone like that. It's not so easy. I think sometimes that takes a lot of effort to just understand. You talk about understanding your audiences. Sometimes it's worth that effort of just spending some time just figuring out who these people are, rather than chucking something over the fence.
Yeah, and totally. And look, it's the same logic we deploy with customers.
Yeah.
Good customer service is about understanding what will this feel like for the customer. And so we don't put customers through processes that are a pain in the butt for them, because generally customers who suffer problems, they don't come back because they go, this is ridiculous. And so we've all had, call center is a good example. We've all had call center experiences where it's kind of like you get handed from one person. So, confirm your details, and then you get handed to the next person, confirm your details again. Or if you're trying to cancel or change your subscription package, and you get this kind of like, are you interested? And it's like, every question you're asking me is designed to you to try and upsell me something, and I just want to cancel this damn thing, and you're making it really hard for me. That's a good example of something that's unhelpful. Try and cancel a subscription. Germany, by the way, has a really good law on this now, which is you have to make things cancelable within 2 clicks. And so the principle there being, the first click is, I click here to cancel. The second one is, are you sure? Right, just in case. And then you have, and the idea here being, it cannot be any harder to cancel something than it is to take out a subscription. And very often we know that, before to cancel the thing, you've got to phone people up. Well, they're putting an obstacle in your path, unhelpful. If we deployed that, so the nefarious things that are done to kind of retain customers, which I don't think is good for sustainable business, are also things we inadvertently do with employees. We just think, well, how do we make life easier for the organization? If we want people to do all these things that we want them to do, not do the things that we don't, to the right standard, we've got to start thinking about what does it feel like for the employee. And that's, to your point, is saying, let's put ourselves in their shoes. And so one of the things here with the framework is to help you to think about things from there, but also if you're going to have a discussion with them, it's a framework you can have a discussion with someone. So rather than saying, what do you think about this rule? You could, I wouldn't necessarily slavishly go down the framework, but you could start to ask questions that would point you in a direction. It gives you, this is what you're looking for. Look for these sorts of things, and that will give you a clue as to whether, how do they feel about this particular requirement or rule? And then we can look at what can we then do about that.
Yeah. Let's canter through the other parts of humans, and then we can dive into one or 2 points. But U is understandable.
Yep. So understandable simply means, it's a really simple principle, right? Yep. If I don't understand the rule, the requirement, I'm going to find it hard to comply. I might by chance comply with it, but we often neglect that. And so sometimes we over explain things that don't need explaining, and sometimes we don't explain them at all. And then the second bit of understand is also, do the employees think that we understand what we're asking? Because one of the other things that can irritate people is we just need you to do this, right? And the just is a really big clue there. And the just is a massive effort, right? Which is like, and so understand is also, do they think that we get what the ask is? And therefore, do we have some empathy for their position?
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that becomes, it depends on what the rule is all about. And some things like complex regulations that you're trying to get people to help you comply with, that's one where it might be pretty tricky. I don't know, some sort of data regulation or something. Employees don't need to know that this is to comply with this part of the GDPR or the whatever the thing is. You need to click this button or something because that, or make it easy, or
the idea simply is work out what the requisite level of understanding is. So some rules require you to understand in detail to be able to perform whatever it is. You need to understand in detail. That is different to things where you just need an awareness. And so in the book, I talk about the different levels of when we think about a rule or some principle or concept that we're trying to get across to people, is we need to think about what level of understanding do they need. And there are some tasks where all you need people to do is just have a vague awareness that this might be an issue. And so if they see something that is vaguely in that direction, they can go and get help. That's that level of awareness, very different to, I need to have a detailed level of skill. So you can think about recipes, for example. Yeah. If it's just a sort of, a very simple microwave meal, then there's a different level of skill required to cooking a cordon bleu meal with some ingredients that there's been no prep whatsoever, and you're doing it with potato. My favorite example, like fugu, Japanese puffer fish, right, which is poisonous if not cooked by a professional. Those two things, very, very different ends of the spectrum, and therefore the level of understanding required is different. So we're going to make sure that we have that correctly balanced. And often we get that wrong. We assume that if they understand where this regulation came from, well, that might be relevant if there's some backstory as to why this rule, if it's not obvious why a rule is in place, and there's a good story that can explain why that rule is there, then that's great. But often we kind of download, here's the history of this regulation. They don't care. Yeah, they're not interested. There's no point. Don't tell someone this is the such and such rule from 1864, unless there's a reason that the history of the rule will help them to either engage with it or make them do the thing to the right standard.
Great. Okay. Manageable is the M.
Yeah, really, really simple. The harder something is to do, the less likely it is that we are going to do it, particularly if there's a qualitative component to it. So look at how manageable is this for people. The easier it is, the more likely. The harder it is, the less likely. And then we can, can we make it, if it's something that's difficult, make it easier for them. Equally, if we want to think about it, maybe we sometimes want to make it harder, but just balancing that out and thinking about how does it, and it's not necessarily about how easy it actually is. It's how easy it feels. Think about those websites where you're doing a survey or something and it gives you a progress bar to give you a sense of progression, so you know how far it is. That, and they break, asking lots of little questions is better than giving them all in one go. That's about making it feel easier. You're not changing the task, you're just changing the perception of the task. It feels easier.
What is interesting about that example is that's a very low cost intervention that someone can make to get the rate of compliance with a rule or whatever to go up. And there's lots of examples in your book of things, little things that one can do to just make it better and more, as you say, manageable in this case. I want to talk about acceptable a little bit.
Yeah.
Because that speaks to values. And could you just explain acceptable a little bit? And maybe we could just dive into it Because what happens when, the values of the people that you're trying to influence, they don't find something acceptable, and
yeah, and you'll notice as we're going through the framework, right? It gets harder in a way. So just it's taken. Clearly I wanted to base it around a word that was relevant, and humans that's what we're talking about after all. So it was a perfect word, but it also, the reason I like it is we get to a level of making something easy, understanding something's helpful. That's kind of relatively easy stuff. This is starting to get a bit more challenging and difficult. So the further we get down the framework, the more we have to think about what we're doing. And of course, none of us like thinking, so it gets a bit tougher. But acceptable is all around how acceptable will they find, and they being the employees or whoever we're trying to, how acceptable they find what I'm asking them to do. And there's also then questions about your authority in that sphere. So let's take an example of something where it's very obvious. For example, if you work I keep using the kitchen or nuclear power station, it's not going to be unreal. Anybody that questions why they're being told to do something in a particular way in a safety environment, I think, that's it's a lot easier because people recognize that, and if they don't, then you can help them to understand it. When we start to look at sort of what you might call employer overreach, and we've seen this quite a lot post or during the pandemic with people working remotely, is surveillance software. And those sorts of things, and the getting people to come back into the office. But we can also see it in things like your ability to have a social media account. So does your employer prevent or police you having a social media account? Now, if you work for the security services, you would probably go, actually, I get why they don't want me to have that. They're tightly policing it. If you happen to work for a retailer, you might go, well, what business of theirs is it that I have a social media? How dare you tell me what I can and can't say on my social media? Now, from the organization's perspective, you can go, well, actually, there's a risk there because if an employee says something racist or offensive or inappropriate, then it'll be, particularly on things like LinkedIn, it'll be tied back to us. So you could see a logic as to why the employer goes, we need to put controls around that. I don't care that the employee's sitting at home, they pose a risk to my organization, I need to control that. So from an organizational perspective, and that's where acceptable, often rules and things start and go, well, of course we need to mitigate this risk. Too big a risk, we're going to put a rule in place. And we have the right to do it because back to the employment contract. But if we start to think, well, what will the employee feel about that? Is that going to irritate them? And do they, they might understand the risk, but they might think you have no right to tell them how to do that. And of course, then we get into the realms of what does the law say, what's ethical, what's moral, and it starts to get quite challenging. And so I'm not afraid here of opening up a challenging box and saying there may not be an ideal solution, but there may be something that sticks out. And you go, the reason they're not doing that is they just don't think that's acceptable. We've overstepped the mark here, and maybe we need to dial it down a little bit in terms of how. And this is, I think, the return to the office discussion. Lots of people are saying, well, actually, I've demonstrated that I can work successfully outside the office. Why are you suddenly dragging me back? That's unacceptable to me. And so we can start to, so it becomes much, much more subjective. And of course, in larger organizations, you will have different, if you're in different countries, different cultures, all of these things start to get more challenging. And that's the other reason I wanted to bring this in here, because I think we see in multinational companies, particularly, something's created in head office in one country. And it might be applicable for the rest of that country, but chances are it may not be. But you then spread it globally. I had this at UBS. Lots of an idea that's brilliant in Zurich may not land at all well in New York or in Cape Town or wherever because of cultural and other differences. And so what people find acceptable in one context may not be in another. And it's not a logical discussion. It becomes a very, very emotive discussion based around a ton of factors. And so that's what I'm saying is we just got to think about it. Yeah,
no easy answers, but how'd you sort of test for this? I mean, how would you sort of, you've got a rule that might, let's say it's, working from home or not. And you've got some people who, in parts of a large number of people who say, the last 2 years we've been working from home, we're getting our, our stuff done. Now you're asking us to come into the office X days a week or full time or.
Well, or ultimately, the employment contract fallacy, right? It's not a fallacy when ultimately you want to use it, right? You can use it. So what I'm saying to people there is there isn't necessarily a prescriptive right or wrong answer to this. It's a case of saying the reason we have a challenge with this particular requirement is because it is on some level, our perspective on what is acceptable doesn't seem to match their perspective. And then the question is, do you want to try and close that gap? Do you want to close that gap either by forcing something onto people, or do you want to close that gap by recognizing that actually they may feel that way? And so then you're thinking about the challenge of the issue. So what I love about this is that this isn't a sort of, here's the rules how to do it. This is the dynamics to start exploring and thinking about and recognizing where you're pushing it. And I'm not saying to employers, don't push, don't use the employment contract. But if you are constantly putting a set of rules out there that is pushing the limits of what they think is acceptable, you are gonna get unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences might be people leave. And of course, it's not necessarily going to be your worst performers that leave. It might be your best performers that are most irritated by this. But the second thing is that even if they go along with it, what you'll find is minor acts, and this may even be subliminal, but we have all seen it. I'll give you an example of some of the sort of thing in a second. But we've all seen examples of people rebelling against the machine where they're irritated. So you get silly little things really annoy people. So if, for example, companies cut back on little perks, like I don't know, and you may not even call this a perk, right? It's free stationery in the office. Suddenly you have to buy your own stationery, or you used to get free lunch and you do no longer, or there was something they've taken away from you that used to be there, or something that people just accept as a norm for the interest of cost cutting you've removed. People do crazy things, right? They just try and get their own back, and they kind of go like, how can I claw this money back? And we see this with expenses. You change the rules on expenses where taxis home, for example, if you're working late, people do all sorts of things. I remember the banking, there's great stories of you can get a cab after 9 p.m. And so what people would do was and you can get food in the office after 8 p.m. And so they push that back, and all that people would do is they'd go to the gym and then come back into the office so that they could then get benefit from the well, totally not what you wanted at all. But people would do it more because they took pleasure in legging one over the company. And actually, I don't think this particular bank saved any money because the levels, they were like, oh, people were working hard. No, they weren't. They were just going to the pub, going to the gym and then coming back to circumvent that particular rule. And so things that irritate people, if you think about any business, there's lots of consumer businesses that I had stopped using because they did something really stupidly, pathetically small, right? They refused to refund me on a minor thing. And I'm never using those people again. Terrible experience, right? That same thing will happen with employer. So that's why acceptable is really, really important, and just recognize where you're potentially pushing them too far.
Yeah, great point. All right, normal is the N.
Yeah. So normal is two things. One is normal in the sense of is that's what's generally happening. So this is you might think about sort of behavioral dynamics like social proof and what's going on elsewhere. What are you seeing? Is everybody else complying with this rule or not? And that will drive it. So if I see that people at the top of the organization are not complying with a particular rule, and I'm expected to, that sends a certain signal to me. Or if nobody's complying with it, we're told everybody's complying with this rule, but we can see people aren't. That's not going to help. The second one is what's typical in this particular dynamic. So there may be, look, in your industry may have very specific dynamics that mean that you can either get away with things you couldn't get away with in other contexts, or you absolutely can't. And you sometimes see managers come in from one industry where there's a certain norm, and they then have an expectation they can just carry that through into the industry that they're in. And that may be feasible, but it may not be. And so recognizing what is, again, it's a matter of perception. But people will find data points to back up that perception. But if we see something that we think is abnormal, that's weird, that's unreasonable, it blends into acceptable, right? These things don't neatly sit as separate categories, but it's slightly different in the sense that it's saying what's standard practice here. And so back to, if you work for the security services, what you are used to your employer telling you can and can't do in the whole of your life is different to if you're working in a retailer.
Certainly. Yeah. S is for salient. And that's one I had to sort of think about a lot more than the other. I just remind myself what we mean by salience, and wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So in a way, I like the word because it really does get to the matter, but it's the one word I have to explain to people, and it's a bit more challenging. And that's one why, again, we are, let's be honest about this. We are trying to get this into the word humans. Yes. We have to find words that are there. So we could have, ideally, if there'd been an R in there, it would have been relevance, but I think it's quite neat that it's the last one, because I think in a way it is subjective. So what salient, it kind of means, is it relevant? Is it grabbing my attention? And that's not just a case of, have you done something where I note that I kind of go, what was that noise? But it's kind of, does this resonate with me? Does it get to me? Do I think this is useful or relevant information? And so the idea of salience is, the more salient something is, the more we notice it, the more we pay attention to it, that will have an impact on our behavior. So this can play in all sorts of different ways. So it'll be, if something is unfamiliar to have never seen it before, we'll pay much more attention to it than something we recognize. And we know this if, for example, you're driving somewhere, or in your case, cycling somewhere, Ben, that you have never been to before. That's a totally different exercise to cycling to work, which you've done hundreds of thousands of times. You'll have done that same route, right? And so the attention span that we have, and that's why when we on our normal commute, probably can't remember a commute when we think about it, because it's a journey we do so often that unless something unusual happens, we just gone on an autopilot. Great use of energy in the body, because there's no point in thinking too hard about something if we can just run on autopilot. But it also means, back to Brian Cullinan, he was on autopilot handing out the envelopes, right? It was ironically a red envelope, right? So the envelopes are very salient in and of themselves,
right?
But he wasn't really paying much attention to it. What was written on the envelope was not salient to Brian Cullinan, and that's what led to the mistake. And so there's a good example, right? The color red, if there was only one envelope, if all the envelopes were different colored, he might have paid attention, but they're all red for theatrical purposes.
Right.
But we can see that by the time he's come to his, I'm guessing, 20th or 30th envelope, right, it's no longer salient. He's not really paying much. He's not reading them. He's just literally going through. So you can see how that mistake happened. And the same happens with our attention span and what we're focusing on. And so if we want people to do things, now there may be times where we want them just to go on autopilot. We don't care. Right. Then salience may play a different role. Maybe we don't want to make it salient. We don't want to highlight. If we've got a big problem with lots of people breaking the rules, we don't want to highlight it. Reverse would be, imagine, and we see this in the movies, the perp walk, right? So the FBI come in and they arrest someone in an office, and then they walk them through the office, typically in banks, right? Through the trading floor, so everybody can see, and it's highly, they don't take them out through the service elevator, right? They walk them through the thing in cuffs, so everybody can see
Charlie
them.
Sheen in Wall Street or whatever.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so that's done to make it super salient to everybody involved, and that's a deliberate piece of theatre that they're putting on there to send a signal. And so it's designed to make something salient to people. And so what we want to do when we think about salience is highlight things you want people to be aware of and pay attention to, i.e. stuff they need to think about. And you want to make things less salient that you don't want them to pay attention to. For example, if there's widespread misconduct in an organization, don't highlight that fact to everybody. And so I think of salience a little bit like, is it on people's radar? Yeah. Are they and not in a sort of passive bleep, 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 it's just there in the background, but are they focusing on it? Have they got their attention on it? And so there are things that we can use to get it onto people's radar and grab their attention. And if it's on there, they'll think about it a bit more. And so really, the airport security, we're making it salient to you, not in the sense of you enjoy it or you think it's relevant to your thing, but that you are aware it's happening. And so that's why I think it's quite a powerful dynamic to be saying, can we play with this sense that we focus on things, our attention, and this is why I think about social media, what people are doing with social media posts, they're just trying to grab our attention. And this is a really good illustration, why people watch absolute crap. I mean, just utter distraction, or they get fed conspiracy theory. And you've had Sander van der Linden on your show. Talk about why do people fall for conspiracy? Well, they keep seeing a lot of it. It starts to become more relevant to. I'm onto something now. It's grabbed their attention, and so this war for attention, that is ultimately the battle that we have when we want people to comply with rules or do something we want them to do or not do something we don't want to do. We need to get their attention for that to happen. Now, there are some things we can do without grabbing their attention. We may be able to design the world in a way they don't even notice they're being compliant. But in many cases, the reason we have rules and requirements in place is to stop the natural flow, because if it was happening anyway, you probably wouldn't need to police it or put the restriction in place because it would just be happening. So what we're doing is we're intervening to try and change behavior. Well, if we're doing that, a key component of that is often making things salient, grabbing people's attention. And then, as we know from social media, we can get to do all kinds of things, right? But we just need to be thinking about how we're grabbing their attention, and are we grabbing it in the right way?
Yeah, and I guess that also works in the sense of when you're helping people spot when something seems off, right? Because if, for example, the theater in the airport security, if the metal detector beeps loudly and the guy or the woman ahead of you in line and they just let them through. There's, wait, that's something. Are you sure? Or did you not notice that? Or, that kind of a thing as well.
Yes.
But what I like about the framework as well is that it's a framework, right? And so it's designed to get people to think, and there is not enough thinking in large organizations. Actually, you could argue that big organizations are there to not make you think so much. I'm curious how it's kind of landed with folks and what your response to that is, because I can kind of see some people using it to really test a set of rules. I can see others that want to take that and embed it into whatever software package they have for something or other, and almost like use it to do the opposite, perhaps, of what it's intended. I'm just curious what you've noticed with some of the people that you've introduced this to.
So what I'm doing in the work that I do, but also in terms of the people that are reading the book, is you've got to be curious and interested in this. So there are going to be a ton of people not reading the book. And so the beauty is, if somebody's reading the book and wants to try this stuff out, they're on some level, they're either curious or they recognize that the existing way of doing things might not be working. And I think, what is interesting is we often don't know whether what we're doing is working. The way we judge of success is often we say, well, nothing's gone wrong. Now, that's fine on some level, right? It's a useful metric, but it's kind of like it's a little bit too late, because if you're measuring it on that basis, you're waiting for something to go wrong. And they go, oh, we should have done something about that, which if it's a matter of life or death or a serious consequence, that's not great. Yeah. And so I'm really targeting people that want to change things. Now, there's lots of vested interest in not changing it. So if you have been doing something in a particular, there's behavioral science behind this as well, right? If you've been doing something in a particular way and you've been persuading regulators, your board, whoever, that you've got this whole thing, the last thing you want to do is to read some book that goes, maybe we haven't got this right at all. Maybe some of these things are terrible. And so for some people, it's like a willful blindness. I do not want to read this stuff. And that's fine, right? You can continue. I suspect you may become a reader later on, but it's fine. There's no need to touch it. More interesting for me, because I don't have the energy to have fights with people around, are we doing it the smartest way possible? And the book is not designed to say it's my way or the highway. It's designed to say, you may be doing traditional approaches to things and it may be working perfectly, and that's great. But have you thought about why? And then maybe you could make it a little bit better. And so I want people who are thoughtful around this and who are curious about what's happening. And so if we get to that point, then I say, well, why might people do this? Well, there's some people that react because they recognize it's not working, or they have evidence in front of their eyes it's not working, or there's evidence it didn't work at a competitor, and suddenly they're like, well, that could have happened here. What do we do about it? Got other people who are the kind of like, they want to change things, right? They're fresh in post. They've been given new responsibilities. They're there. So there's a drive. In both of those cases, something has happened, right? An incident has occurred, or somebody has a job has changed that, and you need to make a mark. It's good for both of those things. The other category that you've got is the sort of curious people who kind of intuitively have known that things aren't necessarily working. I sort of know that this training's a bit BS, but I don't know what to do about it, right? Because I've never thought about it. And those are the most interesting ones. And that's why I talk about the real world. And I say to both my clients, but also people reading the book, look, I don't know your environment, your context, the history of what's happening, the details of it. I'm not all over that. But what I'm trying to do is to point to things that generally are worth reflecting on, and to say, think about them in your environment, and to try and give you the keys to unlock it in your world, so that you can say, oh, let me think about these particular dynamics here and see what works in that space. And that's why I pick the real world, because it's less, it's more fun to talk about. But secondly, we can latch onto it and say, okay, that's something that we can all recognize. And this tension between what we see as individuals, as citizens, walking around, and then what happens to us when we're in a kind of corporate environment, it feels a bit weird sometimes, where there are things we're asked to do that are just odd. And I think part of that thing is that we sort of say, well, okay, this is a work environment and this must be different. And of course, there are things I can do in my private life that I can't do. I always sort of joke around, I can walk around at home in my underwear. If I tried to do that in the supermarket, I would probably get arrested, right? And so there's a distinction in society. Not everything needs to be the same as in your private life, but if things that irritate us in our private lives or we think are silly are probably going to have the same impact in the work environment. And so what I'm doing is really helping people to dissect that. And so the lovely thing has been people coming to me and saying, actually, here's a context in which it's been really useful. I'm like, I didn't know anything about that industry. I, knew nothing. And that's really interesting. And then we have a conversation. And the other message I want to say to people, if you read it, there's something that makes no sense, right? You go, then let's have that conversation. Because I just want to, we're all learning as we go here. And I've just put down what I think based on the site. I'm bringing kind of academic research / practical experience, bringing those two things together and saying, this is what I think works, but I'm really open to having those kind of conversations. So it's backed up by practical real world stuff, and there's some strong academic research, but it's designed to kind of get people to think and thought, and so reject the stuff that doesn't work for you. And so annoyingly, I haven't had those. By the way, everybody feel free to buy the book and be this person. I haven't had people come to me and go, this is the biggest load of rubbish I've ever read. Probably because you wouldn't read the book in the first place if you weren't minded to at least be, if you weren't somewhat open-minded. And so it's been pretty positive reaction so far.
Yeah, no, it's great. Maybe we could just zoom out a little bit, but also like if someone is kind of like casually wandering through a bookstore and comes across the title, for me, kind of a first impression would be more of a perhaps a societal thing. Like, wouldn't just the average, let's remove whether or not someone's an employee or someone who sets rules or whatever, but wouldn't it be great to live in a sort of a society where rules are more human? And I suppose we had a big test case around this with regard to COVID, right? And I'm just wondering what would you like the people who are either reading this book or applying these concepts, what would you like them to help make the average person or the person who has to obey rules? We all have to obey rules or follow rules. What should that feel like? Like what does a human rule feel like?
So you make a really good point in the book, by the way, which is I think that having the word compliance on the jacket is, and that's why it's got some cute little images of people on it, right? As opposed to just being, and I deliberately didn't want to go with an academic publisher that would make it look boring. So it's designed to sort of pique people's attention. But there is an interesting question about that tagline isn't necessarily going to warm itself to other people. So I quite like to surprise people with that and to take the brand and take it a different direction. But on your point, I mean, I think very often the attitude that people have when they're confronted with ridiculous bureaucracy and processes that they hate, and it's just, well, I guess it has to be that way, right? That's the way things have to be. And I think to a certain extent, there are going to be situations where we will have to do things that we don't want to do for societal benefit, right? And we all have to pay taxes. We all have to, there are going to be things that probably cannot be done. But there are so many other things where we just, the stupidly, badly designed processes where people haven't thought about the outcome they're looking for, or they're lazy, or they're just, they're taking the same approach. Teachers that would say, just listen to me and just sort of, and not inspire you. It's just, you're listening to me because I'm your teacher, right? And not trying to engage people. And I find that unacceptable. I think in the 21st century, we need to be working much more with human, because we've got a ton of problems as a planet. I mean, literally we need to solve the climate crisis. We need to think about equality. There's lots of horrible things going on in the world that we need to solve. And I just think we don't have time for tedious processes and boring processes that don't need to be there. There'll be a small percentage of things that probably sit in that category, but there's so many things I come across where I just go, this sucks. This is a waste of time. This is irritating. And I think we've got a level of non-compliance with things, level of bad outcomes that occur, not because those bad outcomes are the default, but because we kind of make that happen because we're not thinking carefully enough about how we do it. And so I would say, and you to your point around everybody is that we're all rule takers. We're also all rule setters, using the loosest possible sense. People with kids are creating in control environments for those kids. But as parents get older, we're creating control as the relationship flips. We create rules and controls around them. We have relationships with our partners, with our neighbors, and so it doesn't matter who you are. You're a rule taker and a rule maker on some level because we're influencing people. And so I just think we waste so much human capital on nonsense that is ineffective and irritating people. And so my big vision for the world is that we get rid of stupid rules, stupid processes, stupid policies, stupid training, and we don't see a diminution in the qualitative outcomes. In fact, we see an improvement in things. The world is safer, the world is nicer, people are kinder, we make better use of our resources, people have more opportunities, there's less prejudice. I genuinely believe all of this points in that direction, because one of the things that is interesting about rules is that rules also create a sort of hierarchy in the sense of either you have people that are not subject to them. And we see this with governments, they're the one rule for us, another rule for them. But the second thing is, if you have rules, that also plays into things like social norms and knowing how to behave. So think about things like you find yourself in a fancy restaurant with a ton of cutlery, and some foods are harder to eat than others, and people not knowing how to eat those foods, and that's socially embarrassing. And so there's lots of things that are created that are designed to instill a sense of hierarchy. We put rules in place to subdue people and to stop them from doing certain things. And we can see that in the world, clamping down on protests and various other things that I find a bit challenging. Rules are used as weapon, and I don't want to sound like some sort of revolutionary, but rules are used to oppress people. And I think we need to just be very, very careful and thoughtful around that. And I think there's very little thought often going into these things. And if we could put even a little bit more thought, we could just make the world a better place.
Yeah, that's great. That's there's a profound philosophical discussion we could have around that. But you do mention this in the book, that a lot of the rules that organizations have, they're designed with the sort of proposition in mind that employees are not to be trusted, that we're not to be trusted, which is not a good starting point at all. And particularly when you think about changing, societal norms, the way in which, millennials are thinking about things, it's actually a pretty poor way to run an organization, let alone a society.
I think it's all based, if you think about school, and I know that education has moved slightly, Ben, since you and I were there, but nonetheless, the basic sort of, we take a lot of models from the school, the sort of, we're just going to tell you what to do. And look at appraisals and look at bonuses and incentive programs. A lot of this stuff is borrows from historical models that I don't think are necessarily valid for getting the best out of people. And I think there are lots of things that are sort of done just, and sometimes it's willful, it's awful kind of. I'm just going to tell you what to do because I can do it, and that's my authority. I'm going to throw my authority around. Like bad teachers have to do when they've lost the classroom. They sort of wield the stick in historically, literally, in some cases. And I think if we just thought about, look, if we want to get the best out of people. And I'm not saying not the most, right? This is not about exploiting the best out of people. We need to create environments in which people are able to flourish. And that involves taking a degree of risk, right? Because every moment of creative flourishment, of innovation comes with a degree of risk. But as a society, I don't think we can afford to not do that anymore. We've constrained what people are able to do. And so I want to just free people a little bit up. And one of the ways that we do that is that we have sensible rules that stop undesirable outcomes and get good ones. So, for me, the model here, and it's difficult in practice, but there's a nice model I talk about in the book, which is what Netflix do. And they have two different kinds of outcomes that they look at, right? So they have recoverable errors and irrecoverable errors. Irrecoverable errors is stuff that will take the company down, that's going to cause major problems, stuff that's entirely unacceptable. We do not want to have this happening under any circumstances. And that, bullying, sexism, racism, loss of client data, I guess, all their servers go down, those sorts of things. And then you've got recoverable errors, which is stuff we'd rather not have happening, but actually we can cope if it goes wrong. And maybe there's an opportunity to learn. And they focus all of their efforts on and around controls and training and around the irrecoverable stuff, the stuff that really matters. And they focus on that. And the other stuff, it's not to say you can do what the hell you like, but they're a little bit, they recognize that. And I like that because that's superhuman. We all know there are situations in life where we could get killed if this goes wrong. And there are situations in life where, frankly, the rule is a bit stupid and a bit silly. And now sometimes we get it wrong. And actually the thing we think is really stupid is actually there's a really, really good reason, but nobody's bothered to think about whether we can understand that. And so if it's well thought out rule, then make the effort to think about your target audience. And so even if it's a brilliant rule and you haven't thought about them, that's missing a trick. And so I like this idea of thinking about what really matters. What do we really have to, and where can we think slightly differently? But all of that requires us to understand the population that we are trying to influence.
Love it. And I love that example in the book. I actually highlighted that quote about Netflix because it's also I think a very valuable principle in decision making, because if something's reversible, then you could probably go ahead more easily than if it's irreversible. So there are very few sort of irreversible big life decisions that we tend to make. So
I hope that's true.
I think if you think about the number of decisions that we make in a day, most are probably reversible in some way. So, and I love that you brought that out with regard to rulemaking. We've bounced around a little bit, and I'm just conscious of time, but there were a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about, and one of them is, so you've got these 6 rules, and you have a thing called radar as well. And one of your rules is that 100% compliance is neither achievable nor desirable. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit further, because there might be some, Explain that to my listeners.
So it sounds outrageous, right? And of course, one of the things that one tries to do when one has these things is to sort of provoke. Again, it's about being slightly provocative. But
sure.
So I am not saying that this is a free for all, and that we should assume that everybody will break rules all the time. But what I'm saying is we often set this target of 100% when actually it's not necessary. There are certain things that we don't. It would be great if everybody did them. But we don't need. If you take COVID as a really good example, right? And let's park whether any listeners that think mask wearing or vaccines are silly, right? I'm on the opposite side of the debate to you, but so that I don't alienate you, let's think about these things, right? Whether or not you think they're a good idea, let's think about how they work, right? So mask wearing is designed to stop the spread of it, and the vaccine again stop you getting it, but also stops you spreading it, right? So if we look at those things, you don't need 100% of people to comply with both of those things, and they're very different things, of course. And one of the things I pick out in the book is that mask wearing is something you need people to do if it's going to be effective all of the time when they're with other people, and you need them to do it to a certain quality. That's different to getting the vaccine, which is you just need to show up at the right time and it'll be handled by a medical professional. And once you've done that, sure, there are repeat vaccines to be got, but once you've done that, job done. It kind of doesn't matter whether you don't like it after that point, right? Because you've been vaccinated. Whereas mask wearing, the moment you decide, it suddenly becomes ineffective from that point on, and there's a qualitative component. So if we look at all of those things, the way I would approach those and other challenges is not to try and necessarily achieve 100% in all cases, because if you look at herd immunity as a good example, you don't need everybody to have done those things. Now, you can't go and say to everybody, we don't need all of you to do this, right? You need to play as if it's though, but you need to recognize the reality is not getting there. We see transport authorities talking about, our goal is 0 accidents. It's on the one hand, it's admirable. It sounds great. On the other hand, it's delusional. It's never going to happen, right? Unless you remove humans from driving. But even then, we know that machines can cause accidents, and we've seen it with Teslas, right? And even when they get better, that's going to be an issue. So my point with it is to say, let's start to think about what outcome do we actually need to have. Now, for some rules, 100% is absolutely what you want. I don't want anyone getting killed. I don't want any, there's certain principles that, back to Netflix's irrecoverable errors. Those things, we should absolutely have 0 tolerance in those spaces. But if we look at our entire world and we say there are no circumstances under which we can have anyone ever breaking any of our rules, then that's delusional. And it becomes a little bit North Korean in the sense of, you just think, well, that's just BS, right? That's just not realistic. We all screw up. We make mistakes. And one of the things that's interesting, if you don't have room for the repentant sinner to come back and say, I screwed up. Now, you don't want people to go, oh, by the way, I just released all of the credit card details of all of our clients on the internet. Sorry. Right? I'm not talking about that sort of redemption, but I'm talking about, I didn't realize this rule was there, and I'm really sorry I made a mistake. And so, if you had this genuine 0 tolerance thing, that would be an issue. So that's one aspect of it, is to say it's unrealistic, it's inhumane. And you cause a problem if you say to every single person that's crossed the line, well, you're on the wrong side of the line now. That's it. Because then anybody that's inadvertently broken a rule, and we can all particularly if you've got a long rule book, it's easy to inadvertently break a rule. Right? If there's no path back for the redemptive sinner, people will just try and cover stuff up. And so, so simple analysis. If I'm in a stage where I automatically think I'm going to get fired for breaking any rule whatsoever, let's take an extreme case. Then once I've broken one rule, I might as well break 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Because I'm already in that space. And that's another reason I think it's unrealistic. But here's the slightly less obvious thing, which is actually we need to have a few people breaking the rules to know that we've calibrated them correctly. And this is where it gets slightly controversial. But if you took a speed limit, for example, and you said, we've never had anybody break the speed limit, how do you know that limit is kind of calibrated correctly? You almost want 1 or 2 people, because there are going to be situations in which that speed limit is not that applicable. And you want to know that, okay, if we've got 1 or 2 people who've broken this particular rule, then actually that kind of tells us we've got it right. If we've got thousands of people doing it, maybe we've miscalibrated the rule. Always possible that lots of non-compliance with a particular rule doesn't actually mean you've got a whole load of people. As I explored in the book, if 1 or 2 people break a rule, you've probably got a people problem. If lots of people breaking a rule, you've got a rule problem, right? Which means that either people didn't understand it or the rule stopping something legitimate from happening. It's an important tester of the rules to have the odd thing. Because also, if you're not seeing anybody breaking a particular rule, is it worth having the rule in the first place? Right? Does nobody ever break that rule? In which case, why does it exist? Or are you not catching them? A rule that's never broken suggests to me, and you think it's something important. If you think about it, look at it and say, well, we would probably expect in a population of 1,000 people to have one person that had done whatever it is. And we've no evidence of that. Well, that's interesting. Why is that? And so if you start to think about it as actually we don't, having a clean bill of health isn't necessarily a good thing. And it's lots of other, if we just think about, bacteria, for example, it's not good for us to live in a totally sterile environment. It's very strange. So recognize those environments where a sterile environment makes their food preparation. We want that to be sterile, 100% compliance. If we're in the creative space, of course, people are going to, we want people to break rules occasionally and they might. And so thinking about what kind of rule are we dealing with? And is the outcome that we've got, is the behaviors that we're seeing off the back of it, does that feel about right? Is this, are we missing something here? Are we not looking for the right thing? And so thinking about rules not as we have sorted this, we've nailed it, but as experiments. Because they are, they're behavioral intervention, they're attempts to experiment. So how do we know those experiments are working? Well, let's just think about what results might we expect to see? What are we actually seeing? And how can we do that? And so if we go out there and say that no rules must ever be broken, and we never have a mechanism for tracking, we never think about things we can't see, we're just missing opportunity. And we are presuming that we've got it 100% right, which we won't have done by default. There'll be some rules that are stupidly drafted, some that are pointless, some that have never, that wrongly calibrated both ways, that permit things that shouldn't be permitted, or that don't permit legitimate things from happening. And so I want rules to be seen not as hard and fast things from the perspective of the rule makers, not hard and fast things, but actually ongoing attempts that we need to review and think about and recognize where we might have missed something and where we've potentially got it wrong.
So that is a very human response, and which is, you wouldn't expect anything less. But I'm also trying to think of people in rule-making roles who might say, "Oh, we can't have this because then we open up the slippery slope, right? We say a little bit of rule breaking is okay, and we acknowledge that, and then that just kind of opens the door for rationalization and rationalizing unethical behavior, and pretty soon,
So that's a sort of I crudely refer to these things as sort of fundamentalist viewpoints, right? Which is, and I agree that those dynamics, which interestingly, what you just described is a behavioral dynamic, right? Slippery slope is a behavioral dynamic, as is the idea that, well, if one person gets away, everybody else will think they can as well. All of those things are behavioral. So what's really interesting is that when people say the reason you can't do this is the human behavior that will result from that is things we don't want. Oh, that's interesting. So you're thinking behaviorally now, right? So you're already on my side when you make that argument. You just don't realize it. Yeah. And so what I'd say to those people is, I am not saying this is a free-for-all. I'm saying let's design it in a way where we think about all of those factors and a ton more, because nothing that's written in the book contradicts those particular things. But I would say, let's recognize, one, that people are fallible. And so we probably do need somewhere in our framework some minor rules that people can break, and we need to cut people some slack, which is why if you look at most disciplinary processes, right, for the really serious stuff, you'll get fired instantly. But there are gradations of things where we say, okay, this is a level 1 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so
you get a warning or
exactly right. So we build these things up and we say together. And so we recognize that behavioral dynamic there, because implicitly you would fire everybody immediately the moment they broke any single rule. And so we've already built in some behavioral thinking into the way that we do things. And I'm just saying, let's extend that a bit further. And let's say to ourselves, if we start to think about the rules in the way that I'm highlighting, we're being honest about the behavioral stuff, and we're recognizing that it's nuanced and it's challenging and there's lots of factors that come into play. And we're bringing in the option, as we discussed before, to use some slightly different tools, some slightly different techniques. And maybe that 3 strikes and you're out thing is brilliant, or it may be the worst thing ever. You may, and there are other tools that we can use. And look, I always think disciplinary things, either rewarding people for good behavior or disciplining them for bad behavior, ought to be not the first thing we do, but the last thing we do. Right? Bring that in at the end when all other tricks have failed. Right. So I say to people, go through your framework and just think about it behaviorally and say, is it doing exactly what I think it's doing? Not what I would like it to do, but what it is likely to be doing. And just because you have no evidence that people aren't breaking your rules, everything is okay, is nonsense. Because look at it this way. Let's imagine you've got a compliance function, right, that pumps out lots and lots of training. If just one training thing that I'd have to do is tedious and boring and like sends us, then that starts me off to think these people are idiots, right? They don't understand me. They don't care about me. If I get a second or a third, I'm then going to go, anything that comes out of this these people are idiots, right? This is just not interesting. Anything that comes out of that factory, I have no interest in. And so what you can find is that rule in one context, and maybe not one on its own, but imagine a sort of series of these things. I get the impression that this is that sort of function. I start to react accordingly. And so what you can find is that some things that may seem totally unrelated can be a little bit like if a restaurant or a retailer irritates me with one small thing, I may not go back for a bigger thing. There are knock-on consequences to these things. And I'm saying, look at the entire program and don't look at things in isolation. Say, what message are we sending to these people across the piece? And sure, we're going to have to piss them off from time to time. We're going to have to get them to spend time doing tedious processes. But let's know that. Let's look at what's the total effort that we're required to go through to do these things. And so I don't think anyone that sort of wants their program to be effective should be doing anything other than saying, is it working? And I'm trying to give you a mechanism by which you can think about, is this actually effective? As opposed to saying nothing's ever gone wrong. Or it's the way we've always done things, or it's what everybody else does. You wouldn't use any of those arguments for any other business area.
Yeah.
Right?
Great. And so I'm just conscious of time. There were just a couple of other things. I was also thinking, like, if you've got your 3 strikes, I was just sort of thinking, well, I better make sure that I score big on my first 2 strikes. So the real punishment happens on the third. So you sort of depends on what what people are incentivized to do. But we didn't talk about this sort of radar. You have another framework called radar. I don't want to go into, I think we've got time to go into all the details of it, but if you just quickly touch on what it is and how it relates.
Yeah. So what it says is, if we're trying to influence human beings, right, trying to influence their decision making, their behavior, then one of the things that we can do is we can use them as a means of giving us early warning of where we might have problems. So rather than waiting for them not to comply with our rules, we can say to ourselves, what information do we have that might suggest there's a potential risk there? And we can start to look at which rules, and again, include training and all these sorts of things in the category of rules, which interventions might pose a great degree of problems. Now, the most obvious one is, well, we know we've got a problem with a rule that lots of people aren't complying with, right? So that's an obvious one, and that's the first one I deal with in the framework. But there are other things, like, for example, people paying attention to rules. And I don't just mean paying attention as in sort of reading it, but I mean asking questions about them. And you could measure that in terms of inquiries that you get, how often the people are clicking on it on the intranet and looking at a particular rule. Now, I'm not going to definitively tell you what it means, but I'm saying if you have it's back to salience. If you have a human's attention, that means that they're looking at the rule for some reason. And quick analysis, here's 2 reasons why you might look at a rule. Number one is you genuinely want to comply with it and you want to find out what the rule says. The second one is you want to game the rule and you're trying to look for loopholes, or you've already broken it and you're desperately looking for the loophole to justify what you've already done. Either of those things, and you can't determine necessarily immediately which is, but either of those things are useful. If you've got 2 rules that are fairly similar scope, similar whatever, then you'd say to yourselves, why is this one receiving tons of attention and this one isn't? Now, it might be the one that's receiving tons of attention is one that actually genuinely you can see why, either gifts and entertainment, it's just before the holiday season and people are refreshing their thing. Oh, that's a good thing. Or you could go, it's really confusing, it's super complicated, don't know. Another rule, it might be so well understood nobody ever has to bother looking at it, or it might be no one even knows the rule exists and they're not looking. So we can use their behavior as early warning indicators. My favorite one, which I'll finish on, Ben, because I know we're short of time, is to say, look, a very simple test to say things that irritate you are the things that you circumvent and get around when times get tough. So the test that I ask people to apply, slightly naughty language coming up, is what pisses you off. Right? Go find out which rules, regulations, requirements piss people off. And the reason I use that language is because I'm not interested in things that are slightly annoying. I'm interested in things that are really, really viscerally irritating. Because if you can identify those, you can say, well, why is it having that impact on them? And that's a really big clue. And if they are giving you those clues, chances are it is already a rule that is being bent, circumvented, or is very, very vulnerable when push comes to shove. Because if we don't respect it, we tend not to follow. We know that from every other context. So what radar is about is use your people as a feedback mechanism to tell you, one, where they may already be breaking the rules or where those rules are likely to be broken. And we're using behavioral data, some of which you is hard to get, but some of which you may already have. You just never have thought to get it. And you can start to see patterns of things and compare how do these things. But it's saying if we're trying to control human behavior, then what is the best form of defense against that is to use the humans as an early warning system. Hence, it's called radar. Again, a convenient acronym.
Okay, great. So, and lastly, maybe not lastly, but if someone's listening to this who's really not a rule maker or the rule taker, and there are lots of those things that are pissing them off, I can think of, half a dozen right now, and they just like you people need to read this bloody, you need to read this book. Like, what?
Yeah.
What are you doing? So. Yeah. Any sort of advice for someone who's just like, you've got these things.
So I mentioned before, right, that some of the people that I work with and that are reading the book are people that have intuitively sensed, compliance people that have known that their training just wasn't landing, right, and they've kind of gone through the motions and they've sort of they've lived with it, but they kind of gnawing away at them has been there's something not quite right here. And so what the book is trying to do is to try and sort of give them some hooks. Maybe you can go think about why that might be and what you could do alternatively. You can do the same thing if you are complaining about something. Right? You want to go and you just want to go and argue with your compliance function or point out to someone why this is stupid. This will help you do that because you've then got a framework to go, okay, let me explain to you why this is this is really stupid. And it might give you inspiration for coming up with an alternative. Because one of the things when people say, I don't want to change, rules feel like, because we think of them as etched into stone, right? There's stone tablets of stuff, right? Which is why, and that's part of the problem is they get carved into stone and never get changed, never get looked at, reviewed because the rules are right and people are wrong. Well, guess what? Sometimes the rules are wrong. And so if you want to go and have a discussion, the first thing is you can recognize why is it irritating you? Because particularly humans is going to help you to think about what is it about this thing that is really getting to me? And then the rest of it can let you inspire you. So you can go to them and say, hey, that thing you want us to do, I think it's really crap. And here's why. And you can explain to them. And you can come with an alternative to say, I've been thinking about this. You know what? And these people over here solve that problem why can't we do it like that? You will then get a rubbish argument back if it's compliance, which will be something along the lines of regulatory requirements, blah, 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 blah. Generally not correct, right? They might have, it is an interpretation of the rules. But you can always, but what you can start to do is you can argue with that and say, well, okay, let's see, where does it say in the rules that we need to do that? And you can have a discussion they're not expecting to have with you because you're having it on the detail, which will freak them out a little bit. But it's a helpful guide to you to understanding your frustrations. And I think one of the things that what got me into this in the first place when we started the story was I couldn't handle this, right? Because I was irresponsible for something I just wasn't buying into. So I'd had that realization because I had this unique experience. But we all go through irritations with stuff. And I'd like to think this will help people to decode it. So what you could do, I'd love it, obviously, if you bought a copy for your compliance people, read this is really important. Or maybe you just want to keep it tucked into your back pocket and go, I can now have a much better discussion with people. And I'm going to use this as my secret weapon to ask very smart questions and not give them a clue where I might come, could strengthen your argument. So I think it's helpful from that perspective. And look, for risk mitigation, this is the All Things Risk podcast. Well, all of the things that have rules in place are all about mitigating risk. The rule exists for risk mitigation. So as we think about risk appetite, as we think about how do we deliver the risk mitigation programs that we need, all the same things apply.
Fantastic. It's a wonderful book, Christian. Congratulations on it. And thank you so much for coming on to the show. Before we go, was there anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to, other than, I will ask you in a moment where people can follow you and get the book and all that good stuff.
No, I think I will obviously point people to the Human Risk podcast, which you have been on before, Ben, as a source for many of the ideas that I have, and I mentioned this in the book in part because why wouldn't you cross promote your content? But the second thing is there are things I've learned on that about the real world that's relevant, and there's tons of things I've learned on your show as well. So I would point people to the Human Risk podcast to sit alongside this as a good add-on to the listening that they already do.
And so the book is called Humanizing Rules. I presume you can get it wherever books are sold.
Yes, and if people go onto my website, let me just do that cheap plug, human-risk.com, Ben, what they will find is there is a page cunningly marked by the book, right? I'm trying to make it salient for people, what I want them to do. If they click on that, you can get through and you can read sample chapters of it. So if you think you might be interested in it, you can get reading straight away. It's obviously available on all the digital and all the usual stuff.
And will it be translated into any other languages?
So the two questions I get is translations and audiobooks, both of which are in the hands of my publisher. As a podcaster, you'll appreciate I offered my voice to the services of reading the book. That has yet to be taken up, but I live in hope. But the translation thing, all of that happens without me knowing. So I'm told that it gets touted at book fairs, and then magically I will be told. I'll be very interested actually to see how, if they do that, and I'm hoping it will be translated, how some of the frameworks get translated, because obviously the words work in English, but how do they work? So I've already been thinking about how to do it in German. I will stop at the languages I know, but I think there's some room to make it, again, more relevant to those audiences, because you want words that they will remember.
Fantastic. Christian, this is great. Thank you so much for appearing on the show once again. And best of luck with the book, but and for everything else you do. And before we go, you inspire me greatly. So thank you so much for all the good work that you do, all the great work that you do.
Without wishing to sound like a podcaster praising another podcaster who's just praised him, ditto, Ben, thank you so much. And I love the community that you've built up with your show and the guests that you have as well. And so it's an absolute honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. Bye for now. All right, I hope you all enjoyed that. Do give Christian a follow and certainly pick up a copy of Humanizing Rules. Links are in the show notes as usual. And of course, if you like the episode and if you like the show, please share it. It always helps us out an awful lot. We will be back very soon. Subscribe and you will not miss anything. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.